Okay, I'm going to have to adjust here because I'm quite a lot smaller than Lady Derby. Can you all hear all right? Yeah, brilliant. Well, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much to Lord and Lady Derby for asking me to come and join you on this wonderful day. And it's really wonderful to see in the audience so many budding historians. It's fantastic. I gather lots of you are going to be doing GCSE history, which is a brilliant topic, a brilliant subject to do, the best of all. It's great to be talking about a whole series of remarkable women today. There's a very famous historian, long dead now, called A.J.P. Taylor, and he made once this really, I thought, brilliant comment, which is, if you think about it, the past is everything that ever happened anywhere. So all of our family trees, every village, every town, everything, that's the past. And then there are bits of it that we study at school and at university, which we call history, which we choose to say, like, these are the important things, these are the things we want to talk about, and this is history. But in that, there are choices about which bits of the total past we pick out and say these matter to us. And historically, so much of that was about the lives of men and the actions of men. And of course, you know, those things all really matter. But so many of the experiences and the influence of women were kind of passed over. And partly because actually, going back to what we were hearing about before in terms of archives, because politicians and lawyers and all these people who did official jobs were men. Only men could do those roles. So they created the records, which are then the material that people use to study history. But it's so important for us to say, hang on a second, what about everybody else's experience? What about the experience of people who aren't reflected and talked about in this historical kind of record or in way that history is taught? And my daughter, who's 16, who's doing A-level history, told me the other day that they're doing the British Empire for A-level. And she said, they got a textbook that goes with it. And she said, we've got to page 90 in our textbook, that's most of the way through the lower sixth. We have come across so far one woman. And you just think that is ridiculous. Half of the entire population is female. And, the experiences of living through empire was every bit as much a female experience as a male experience. So why aren't we talking about it? So anyway, this is my kind of sort of words of enthusiasm for the subject matter of today, which is to say, let's talk about women, but you could also cut it lots of different ways in terms of people who aren't talked about, and to say how refreshing it is to be part of that, and how much I hope that all of you, when you're doing your GCSEs, will ask the questions of your teachers. Okay, so what was it like for women? Or what was it like for this community of people who we haven't heard about? Because it's only by doing that we make space for it properly. Right, so I'm going to be talking about my countess, as they say, is the 7th Countess of Derby, the wife of the 7th Earl. And just to kind of get our geography, so the 7th Earl of Derby, who we'll come onto a picture of in a minute, was the nephew of Ferdinando, who was married to Alice, who we just heard about. So we're kind of down one generation and over a bit in terms of the family tree. And the 7th Countess is an extraordinary figure. And I'm really going to use this sort of 45 minutes to an hour that we've got to tell you about her and what she did, because I think understanding it it's an amazing story, apart from anything else. And then to, at the end, reflect a bit on what kind of insights her story give us to British history and to the role of women in this period. So we'll come back to that. Right, so our kind of main character then is here on the right, Charlotte, 7th Countess of Derby. And the first thing to say about her is that she wasn't English. She was French. Her family were called the de Tremouille family, French family. And her kind of backstory is not even in England. She comes here at the time of her marriage, but has behind her, in terms of her family and her backstory, a thoroughly European history, which is an interesting thing to reflect upon We'll come to talk a bit about that. And she and her husband, the 7th Earl here, lived through this incredibly turbulent period in the middle of the 17th century, so the 1600s, the 17th century, which was the period of the Civil War in England. And I'll do a little bit of setting the scene on that, because I know not everybody will necessarily kind of have that in the front of their mind. She was born in just about the time of the turn of the century, so in about 1599, or in 1599. She was a highly educated and sophisticated woman. And as you might be able to tell from these paintings, which were painted about the time, or at the time of their marriage, she was slightly older than her husband. So here on the left, you have the 7th Earl of Derby. He was 20, just turning 21 when they got married. She was older. She was 26, turning 27. So there was a kind of little bit of a parity, a little bit of disparity in their positions, if you like, in terms of age and seniority. So she was a slightly older woman. But there was a much bigger disparity in terms of their social status. So to explain that, we've all got a family tree. Mine's got slightly fewer people on it than some of them that we've seen this morning. So here's my subject matter down here, Charlotte de la Trémouille. Now, the thing about her is that essentially she was a princess. And this was very, very central to her character and to the position that she had here and in England. So to explain that, so she was the daughter of someone called Charlotte Brabantina, who married the sort of senior figure of this family called de la Trémouille, which is a very important French family. But crucially, Charlotte herself was the daughter of this man, William the Silent. And William the Silent was the founding father of what we now call the Netherlands, which was then called the Dutch Republic. And he was an extraordinary and really important figure because we've had references to the Reformation a few times. So in the middle of the 16th century, all of Europe really was overtaken by this split, religious split, which is generally collectively called the Reformation, where all of the sort of Catholic Church, which was really the only church around in the Middle Ages, kind of was split apart into Protestants and Catholics. And in each country in Europe, France, in the Netherlands, and in Britain, there was a real sort of fight, sometimes a physical fight, sometimes a political fight, about where that country was going to end up, whether it was going to remain Catholic or whether it was going to become Protestant, which is a kind of reforming form of Christian worship. Now, the crucial thing here is that William the Silent led his people in what's now the Netherlands to form their own breakaway republic, and it was a Protestant republic. So he's like a big hero figure. He is, of his time, he's the President Zelensky of Ukraine, as it were, in leading a nation through a period of tremendous actual proper physical fighting, huge amounts of it, to assert the independence of the nation and crucially, that they were a Protestant nation. So the reason this is so important is that for two reasons, really. One is that Charlotte is the granddaughter of a prince, a head of state. William the Silent became the founding, he isn't called a king, but it's equivalent of that role of the Dutch Republic. So she has that kind of status. But also that he was somebody who absolutely was defined by having taken up arms and fought for religious independence, for a religious position, for Protestantism. And these things were kind of in her blood. So even when she was a child growing up in between France and The Hague, which is the capital of the Dutch Republic, she was already talking about making reference to people who took up arms for religion. It was kind of like in her psyche, in her upbringing. So she grew up between, as I say, France and what we call the Low Countries, so modern day Netherlands, in the early 17th century. She was very well educated. She writes letters to her mother, Charlotte Brabantina, when she can write when she's only 7 years old. She describes how she's already learning Latin and talks about her kind of application to various sort of texts and so on. So she's a bright cookie, and she's brought up, because by this time we're a bit further forward chronologically from the Lady Margaret Beaufort period, where educating women, particularly in aristocratic families, absolutely was something that happened. And she was very much part of that tradition. Her father died when she was very young. So she was brought up by a woman, a widow, who had a great sense of her own status as a daughter of William the Silent, but also who was a significant figure in European politics, and she was trusted by both the King of France and by her brother, who takes over as the senior figure in the Netherlands, to do various actual sort of important political tasks, including being part of sort of convening various meetings to discuss sort of religious arrangements in the Dutch Republic. So Charlotte is brought up in an environment where women and her mother and those around her are, not just sort of shrinking violets. They're absolutely at the centre of political, action, and where the sort of idea that you're subservient and everything to your husband, although sort of technically is the case, it's not being borne out in reality. So when she turns 10 in 1609, she's given a wonderful array of gifts by her royal near relations. The Prince of Orange, who you see here, by this time William the Silent's dead, gives her some jewelled earrings. The prince's wife gives her diamonds and rubies for her 10th birthday. So, she is top tier European aristocratic material, and she is very conscious of this. So here we see a portrait. So this is Charlotte here, and she's portrayed here in a wonderful painting with Amalia van Soms, who marries the Prince of Orange. So she is, as it were, the kind of consort of the Netherlands. It says a lot that they're sitting sort of side by side, equal sort of status. It's not, or at least comparable status. She's not sort of, as it were, in a kind of subservient position, and that reflects her status at the court in The Hague. And it was while she was growing up during the course of her mother's widowhood that she met the sister of the King of England, who lived in The Hague. So Charles I at this time is the King of England. So we're on the Stuart dynasty now. So Elizabeth I died in 1603, the King of Scotland becomes king of what's now Britain, the two countries having been brought together by the King of Scotland's accession to the throne. And James I, when he dies, his son, Charles I, becomes king. So that's the sort of regime here. And Charles I's sister, who's called Elizabeth of Bohemia, lives in The Hague. She's widowed herself, and she's a real kind of sort of matchmaker and sort of manoeuvrer on the European marriage scene. And it's she who takes in hand the question of the marriage of Charlotte de la Trémouille, and who brokers the agreement that she should marry the 7th Earl of Derby. So the marriage takes place. So there's Charles I. So he's on the throne here. His wife is also a French woman, Henrietta Maria. And actually, Charlotte, the 7th Countess of Derby, her mother, Charlotte Brabantina, who we saw, accompanied Henrietta Maria, who came to marry Charles I in 1625. When she arrived, she was part of her entourage of French ladies. She doesn't stay, but she's really connected in at that level. And so the marriage takes place of the 7th Earl of Derby to Charlotte de la Trémouille, and they come here to England together to begin married life. Now, it was on the face of it, like a lot of the marriages we've been hearing about, it wasn't born of the two seeing each other across a crowded ballroom and falling in love. It's absolutely born of, this is a good match. These two people could go together well. It would be good for both their families. But it was definitely one which, although organised by their families, was very, very successful in terms of their relationship. And her correspondence to her mother survives, which is a wonderful thing. So you can really quite get close to her. And she talks about, I'm being so happy to have been married to someone who takes such takes such good care of me, she says, sort of emotionally. She talks about him being somebody kind and after her own heart. So we can see that although they come from different countries and they are slightly different in age and they don't have a kind of history together, that the relationship is very successful from the beginning. We can also see that the 7th Earl of Derby regards his wife as his superior. In terms of her status as a princess of the Orange dynasty, and as a senior figure of the sort of European monarchies, and indeed because of the sort of heroic kind of narrative connected to her grandfather. So it is very interesting, for instance, that he talks about her on a number of occasions, and she talks about herself during her married life by her maiden name. So he, being de la Trémouille is a very, usually when you get married, your maiden name sort of passes out of use and you're just known by your married name, but that wasn't the case in this instance. So they married and they came to England, and Charlotte and her husband were to be found at the court of Charles I and Henrietta Maria in London, attending court occasions, these sort of big theatrical performances known as masques, and generally being part of the sort of London court scene. And it is while they are there that they really find that court is not for them. So you might think on the face of it that Charlotte, as a French woman growing up in France, and the Queen of England as a French woman coming to live in England, that they would have lots in common and that they would become very close. But actually they weren't particularly close. And one of the reasons for this is that Charlotte is a very committed Protestant, going back to her grandfather founding the Dutch Republic. Henrietta Maria is a Catholic. And so although they are both French, they have very different religious allegiances. And, religion really matters in this era. So here we see the Earl and Countess of Derby together, a wonderful painting, which I think is in the Frick collection in New York, by Van Dyck. And you can see here she is dressed in wonderful white silk, and there is her husband. And what this picture, reminds us of, or makes me kind of feels like it sort of denotes, is them deciding that they will be at court a bit. They have to be in London a bit because he has to participate in parliamentary sessions, but that actually basically they want to be up here, and that's where they're sort of much happier. And it's interesting because Charlotte grows up in the most fantastic castles and chateaux in the Loire Valley, which is where all the French royal houses are that were used outside Paris, and Lancashire, lovely though it is like a different place, climate-wise and, environment-wise, but she loves it and she's immediately taken with it. And there's something about the ancient traditions which are still very much part of how the Stanley family operate here, and kind of quite old-fashioned. There was huge, great big entourage. Servants are all in liveries, and almost like a medieval household is still very much going on up here. And I think for her, she finds that a very sort of a convivial and appropriate place to be. So they are installed here. After 1628, they're really very little at court. When he occasionally goes to London, she's very sad. She misses him. She writes about not wanting to be apart from him. They have 9 children. She gives birth to 9 children. 3 of them die in infancy. The others live to adulthood. One son, James, died when he was just 2 years old, and his death was obviously devastating for both father and mother. The 7th Earl keeps a diary in which he records his grief at the death of his son. He's not his oldest son, so it's not a kind of lineage thing. This is about a father's grief at the death of his child, saying that my one hope is that when I die, I will meet him again in heaven, which is a kind of real reminder that all this death, whether it's of children or of adults, these are real people, and they felt the things that happened as acutely as we would now. So here they are up at Knowsley and in Lancashire and Cheshire. So the family holdings are, of course, very extensive up here. Latham House we've had reference to, so this no longer exists, and we'll get a flavour of why in a minute. But this was the great castle, which was the headquarters of the Stanley family. operation, and a massive medieval house, think a bit sort of Windsor Castle-like. There was obviously Knowsley, which was smaller than it is today and was very connected with hunting. There was Derby House in central London, in Westminster, which was their sort of London base. And then they had a house in Chelsea, which is not this house, but I just show you a house in Chelsea to give you a bit of a feel. So there's a lot of, there are a lot of land holdings. And then just a sort of, this is a wonderful map of England made in the 1650s, a little bit later, but you can see the relationship. So Latham, can you see, is up there? And that's the park, that's the great big fence that goes around the park. And then down here is Knowsley with an even bigger park, which was all about hunting. So here they are, and happily creating a family together and playing the ancient role of the senior landholders of the Northwest. Now, all of this was to be shattered by the events of the 1640s. So in England in the late 1630s and 1640s, Charles I began to sort of lose the confidence of the Parliament, the elected Parliament in Westminster over the course of the 1630s for two reasons, really. One was to do with religion. So Charles I, although a Protestant, he was married to a Catholic, and he quite liked a lot of the things that were associated with Catholicism in terms of the way that churches were decorated. Catholicism was much richer and more ornate in terms of interiors and imagery and how sort of ceremonial and elaborate the church services were. And this was very much to his taste. So he started kind of moving the way that religion was practiced in England to what seemed to people to be towards Catholicism. And this was wildly unpopular in a nation which by this stage had become very kind of committed to Protestantism. And the second thing was he also had an idea of what a king should be able to do in terms of raising taxes and sending armies and navies into action, which differed a bit from what the MPs and the Lords and the House of Lords felt should happen. And we won't go into all the details of that, but the consequence was the country fell into outright civil war in 1642. Between the Royalists under Charles I, who were for things remaining as they were, and the people who were known as the parliamentarians, who wanted to see a more Protestant form of church and wanted to see the king stay within the kind of conventional rules of what kings could do in terms of their powers. So the country falls into this state of civil war. It's pretty pronounced and serious, and involves the raising of two armies, which are led on the one hand by Charles I and his supporters, and on the other hand by these two people. So here we see Thomas Fairfax on the left, who is the general who's at the head of the parliamentarian army, and more famous than him, but not second to him in terms of seniority, is Oliver Cromwell on the right, who was one of his generals. So they are heading up the military force in the Civil War, the parliamentarian force. Although Thomas Fairfax was an aristocrat, he was a sort of almost like an equivalent family to the Stanleys, not as ancient and wealthy, but still with wealth and lands around York. And Oliver Cromwell himself came from a family that had considerable lands and a big country house in Huntingdonshire. So, but anyway, they were sort of the leading military figures on the parliamentarian side. The Derbys absolutely fell in behind Charles I, even though they were not, as it were, personally very close to Charles I and Henrietta Maria. They were very clear that their duty was to be loyal to their king. That was the kind of bottom line. And so the Earl of Derby, joined up with the Royalist army and was moving around the country as required to participate in the kind of military, sort of strategic movements during the Civil War. And it was during this time that Charlotte, with a number of her still very young children, was left in charge of Latham House in 1644, and where an amazing siege happened in the course of the summer of 1644, a physical besieging of Latham House, which, as I say, was a castle, so it had high walls, and you could mount cannon on them and so on, could be physically defended. But it was she who was in charge during the course of that siege. And it was really this that absolutely made her reputation, because her defiant determination not to surrender, not to concede, not to feel that the absence of her husband prevented her from holding firm was, it became the sort of talking stuff of not just across Britain, but across Europe. First of all, it was Thomas Fairfax himself, who we just saw, who was leading the parliamentary force that was trying to take Latham House. And he made a whole series of attempts to persuade her to surrender, to move to another house. And at each time, she absolutely wouldn't adhere to his requests. Then when he sort of gave up and thought, I'm not going anywhere with this, and another senior parliamentarian officer, Colonel Rigby, took over, who was a bit less sort of courtly and sort of aristocratic in his way of doing things, and started trying to physically take the building, pummeling it with cannon, firing iron shot. There's a description of iron shot actually crashing through Charlotte's the walls of her bedroom, landing grenades landing in the courtyard, and so on. And she makes a series of sort of incredibly defiant speeches. And in one case, she says, "My goods and house shall burn in my sight, myself, my children and soldiers, rather than fall into his hands, will seal our religion and loyalty in the same flame." So, it's pretty, it's pretty amazing stuff. Here she is as a woman, on her own, with her family, saying, we'll take anything, we're not surrendering, and crucially ties it to religion. Again, this is the sense of her own tradition and the importance of sort of religious, defending your religious position. And there's a particular dramatic moment which is captured in this slightly, my slide's not very good here, but this picture you see of her here is painted a bit later, but it's capturing the moment where at one point, a series of draft terms of surrender are sent to her by the besieging parliamentary officer, and she gets it and she tears it into strips in front of them. And all her supporters go wild and cheering. This incredible kind of theatrical defiance. And it becomes a really seminal moment, which is reported. What newspapers are just taking off at this point. We heard about the printing press. One of the things the printing press made possible, although it didn't happen until about a century after the printing press starts to be widely used, is newspapers and people being able to read about what's happening. And the newspapers of the day report this, and the ministers, the church ministers attached to the parliamentarian army, start giving these really impassioned speeches about how monstrous she is. And they call her the whore of Babylon, sort of biblical, famous sort of biblical sort of woman of kind of to be abhorred. So, her reputation, she's not worrying about this sort of reputational impact. She manages to hold Latham House. She doesn't relinquish it for 3 months under siege, and then her husband and Prince Rupert in the Royalist army arrive, and so she never surrenders. But much to their disappointment, a few months later, as the Royalists are losing the Civil War, Charles I orders them to fall back from here to because essentially the northwest has been lost. And then they move to a crucial place, which we'll be hearing more about, which is the Isle of Man, which is where the Stanley family have had dominion for several centuries. So we'll come on to that. So the Stanleys, the Earl and Countess move to the Isle of Man with their children and they give up Latham House and Knowsley. The Civil War plays out. The Royalists lose, essentially. And Charles I is put on trial by the victorious parliamentarians, and an amazing series of days in January 1649 in Westminster Hall, which is still there. And if you ever go to London to Parliament, which you have the right to go and visit Parliament as citizens of this country, you can see Westminster Hall, which is where Charles I was put on trial. And it was an extraordinary thing. He was tried by the victorious parliamentarians for treason, for making war on his own people. And it was a very controversial thing, and it was only the trial only was enabled to happen because the parliamentarian army made sure none of the more moderate MPs were allowed into the building. And it was during the course of the trial, just as Charles I was about to be condemned to death, that from one of the galleries, because it was a big, huge room with galleries with spectators who all watched the trial, when the person who was leading the trial proceedings said, "We are condemning you in the name of the people of England," a voice, a female voice, rung out from the gallery that said, "It's not even in the name of a quarter of the people of Britain," as in taking issue with the line that this was the will of the people, that he should be put on trial. And that voice came not from Charlotte de la Tremouille, Countess of Derby, but came from Lord Fairfax's own wife. So this is pretty amazing, because he was the leader of the parliamentary army, and his wife, who was could be a subject of another talk because she's an extraordinary figure, was courageous enough, feeling that the victory was being pressed too far and executing the king wasn't what they wanted to do at all, cried out to try and prevent it from happening. And I just hold that thought in your mind, because we'll come back to it. Anyway, it was without any success, and he was executed, and there began the English Republic. Now we go to the Isle of Man, because this is where Charlotte and the Earl of Derby are. Now, I'm sure people who know this part of the world well, you're very clear about the geography, but it's just worth looking at the map for the Isle of Man here, because obviously here it is, in the middle here of the Irish Sea, and the Stanley family had held the Isle of Man as Lords of Man since 1405. It's not part of England, it's its own entity. And it was an incredibly important strategic position. So come 1649, with the execution of the king, all of England is controlled by the parliamentarian army and is part of a new republic that's been declared. The monarchy is abolished and it's a republic. But, of course, it wasn't just England that formed Charles I's landholdings. Ireland and Scotland were also part of the Stuart kingdoms. But neither of those were in the control of the parliamentarian army. The Scots were horrified at the execution of Charles I because he was their king too and they had not been consulted in it. And Ireland was very Catholic and so very much against the parliamentarian government. So at the point when Charles I is executed, all the things that are yellow on that map, sorry, not the Isle of Man, but the yellow bits of England are all controlled by the parliamentarian regime, but Ireland and Scotland are not. So the Isle of Man is an amazingly important position because anyone trying to invade either way could use it as a staging post, either the Irish or the Scots wanting to take England, or indeed for the English wanting to take either of those. But it was in the hands of the Derbys, and they were not giving it up. From 1649, so from the beginning of the Republic, from before 1649, from the siege of Latham House in 1644, they are based here, and it becomes a kind of haven for royalists to gather and to sort of try and kind of get ready for some sort of counterattack to try and push out the parliamentarians and reinstate the monarchy. There's several attempts to try and get the Derbys to surrender, which they absolutely refuse to do. When they're offered terms by the new parliamentarian government, they say, "We scorn your proffers and disdain your favour and abhor your treason." So they're pretty, they're not for compromise. During this time, because of the Earl of Derby's role in the royalist government, he is very much a wanted figure by the new parliamentarian regime. But Charlotte, because she's a woman, slipped slightly outside that, even though she was, commanding the garrison at Latham House and commanding the firing of artillery on the parliamentarians. So she's able to move around, and she goes to London and she carries messages and she tries to lobby her wider European network of friends to come to their aid. Really, being a significant player in sort of trying to build support. The place that they're installed in on the Isle of Man is Castle Rushen, which we see here, which still exists. But this is a painting of it. And this becomes the base of a kind of funny little tiny court in exile that Charlotte presides over, where these royalists gather. She's a kind of hostess and sort of convener of these exiled royalists. And the Earl of Derby, who's always a more kind of retiring figure than she is, he's very bookish, he's a great appreciator of the natural environment, of flowers and gardening. And in a way, they sort of almost have reversed gender roles in terms of very sort of traditional associations. And he's making plans for writing a history of the island. He has the idea there could be a university on the Isle of Man. Anyway, the kind of piece of their sort of slightly strange existence here comes to an end in June 1650. And this is the time when Charles I's son, so Charles I has been executed, but his son is alive, who will be Charles II, but at the moment is just a guy whose father was executed and has no control of his kingdom, decides that now is the moment to try to retake his father's dominions. So what he does is he essentially sails to Scotland, having agreed with the Scots that he can be installed as King of Scotland, and he is getting ready to invade England from Scotland to retake the kingdom. And the Derbys are immediately on high alert to participate in this. The sort of summons is issued for the Earl of Derby to join Charles II, who marches into England at the head of an army in 1651. And he sets off from the Isle of Man with all of these exiled royalist soldiers, leaving, again, Charlotte, Countess of Derby, on the Isle of Man, one of the crucial surviving bits of Charles I's dominions, which is still in royalist hands, leaving her in charge. And he leads a kind of special sort of document confirming that she is in charge and that the government of affairs on the Isle of Man and in their lands he gives into her hands, and he refers to the known wisdom and courage of you, Dame Charlotte de la Trémouille. Again, he calls her by her maiden name. Really interesting. So she is left in Castle Rushen to direct the affairs of the Derby family and the royalist, the remaining sort of royalist resistance on her own. And she feels quite ambivalent in lots of ways, because although they're absolutely clear they have to support the king, because that's the job of a senior aristocrat, she also feels uncomfortable. Her sister writes to her and says, "Don't you have sympathy with these parliamentarians? I mean, they're really serious Protestants like we are. Shouldn't you be supporting them?" And she writes back and says, "Well, yes, but you don't understand. They're completely out of control. The sort of religious sort of free-for-all that's going on is very dangerous, because as an aristocrat and a woman of her age, order was very important, and this disorder involved in executing the king and in the religious freedom of the day promulgated by the parliamentarians really worries her." So the Earl of Derby rides to England. He joins Charles I, and he and Charles I make their way down the west coast of England, and they fight Oliver Cromwell in a big battle, the Battle of Worcester, on the 3rd of September, 1651. On the way, they pass through this place, Boscobel Wood, where the Earl of Derby had various friends. They stop off. The battle is a disaster. The royalists are absolutely wiped out. The parliamentarian army is much stronger than their forces are. And to the great disappointment of the royalists, the people of England don't rise up and come and join them, saying, "Thank goodness we can get rid of this republican regime." They're very, very cautious about it all. They don't want more war. There's been years of fighting already. They want peace. And also because Charles II is at the front of an army that's made up of loads of Scots, who are seen to be very wild and unbiddable and speak in strange, incomprehensible tones, and come with huge sort of Highland swords, and it's all very worrying. So they don't get the support they want. And so after the battle is lost, they all go on the run. And the Earl of Derby knows that if he stays with Charles I, it's much more likely that Charles I will be captured if he's surrounded by lots of royalists. So he introduces Charles I back to these people in the woods at Boscobel, called the Pendrels, and the Earl of Derby goes his own way. And Charles II is hidden in the woods, disguised. Here he is, got into his disguise. His long hair has been cut off. You see, he's got short hair, and he's hidden famously in an oak tree to avoid the parliamentarian troops. So here on the far right is a picture painted very shortly afterwards of him hiding here, being looked after by the member of the Pendrell family, and there's the woods around Boscobel. Meanwhile, Charlotte is on the Isle of Man trying to hold everything together. Now, of course, communication is quite difficult over the Irish Sea, so news about what's going on, what's happened, is, are they finding success or not, is quite difficult to get. And she has the challenge of holding the Isle of Man in the absence of her husband and all of the soldiers that she's gone with, in the face of the fact that the parliamentarian army is clearly much stronger and more successful than the rump that's left of the royalist army. Now, she has to work on the island with the resident sort of head of the island. There's a governor, and then under him there's this role called the receiver of the island, who is the person who's kind of in charge of running the island day to day. And there's a chap called William Christian, who is the receiver of the Isle of Man. So he's one of the sort of retainers of the Stanley family. And so he is, he answers to her and helps her organise the defence of the island. Now, the news of the fact that the Earl of Derby and Charles II have lost the Battle of Worcester reaches the Isle of Man. And clearly it's very, very worrying because, the situation she finds herself in is an extremely difficult one. And she sees that she has got to play her hand really carefully to try to make sure that she kind of negotiates for him to not be executed. And at this point, she's absolutely leading the island's defence herself. The series of castles on the Isle of Man, we saw Castle Rushen, but there's also Peel Castle, which is a very dramatic spit off the side of the island. And so she and William Christian and the other people who are there are trying to keep an eye both to east and west to see whether there are both boats bringing news or indeed an invasion force about to arrive. The Earl of Derby surrenders himself with the Earl of Lauderdale to a member of the Cromwellian army. It's clear the game is up, and if you surrender rather than being taken in arms, the likelihood of you being treated with mercy is much greater. And he is imprisoned in Chester Castle as a consequence. And at this point, it's unclear what's going to happen because he has surrendered voluntarily rather than being taken in arms. And he's put on trial in Chester Castle by a military court. Now, this in itself is quite it wasn't necessarily going to be the consequence. Quite a lot of people who surrendered were simply fined and allowed to go free, or were kept in imprisonment for a prolonged period of time. But he is actually put on trial, and it becomes clear that the reason that he's being treated very exactingly is not really to do with national politics. And actually Thomas Fairfax, who we saw before, and Oliver Cromwell both put in a good word for him and say, are you sure that we need to take it this far? But there's very strong feeling from those who were involved in the siege of Latham House and the fighting in the northwest that he has to suffer for his actions as a royalist general. So that's a local feeling rather than a national feeling. And so famously, and it's kind of amazing to talk about this, with this stool in front of us, the Earl of Derby is found guilty, and despite several last-minute attempts to get a reprieve, again involving Oliver Cromwell himself personally supporting the case for the reprieve, and the brother of John Bradshaw, who was the man who led the trial of Charles I, personally petitioning for him not to be executed. He is executed. Never actually had a look in this to see whether you can see a stool. Not obviously. I think he's standing up at this point. Perhaps that came afterwards. But this is him on the scaffold. He's making his speech. He's about to lie down and have the axe sever his head. And it was said at the time that the scaffold that he stood on, so this kind of timber platform he stood on, was made from timbers from Latham House, from the building that Charlotte defended. He was executed, and as he did so, he made a very moving speech from the scaffold, talking about his wife and his family, and saying he was glad that he was meeting a death that was worthy of his blood. Again, this real strong sense of the time about your own lineage being crucial. Charlotte on the Isle of Man does not know this has happened. So, and because of all this toing and froing about whether he's going to be reprieved or not, she has good reason to believe that it might not happen and that she still has the ability to influence affairs. She is in a kind of a position, obviously, of great vulnerability, but she also has the Isle of Man to bargain with, and she sends a letter to Duckenfield, who's the guy who's holding her husband, offering to relinquish the Isle of Man if her husband's life will be saved. Meanwhile, a parliamentarian spy has been sent to the Isle of Man to try to sort of spread dissent and to convince the Manx people to not to support her. Crucial to their ability, the spy's ability to do that, is the repeating the things that were said about Charlotte at the time of the Latham House siege and afterwards, descriptions of her, this thing about being the whore of Babylon, about being sort of violent, about treating her sort of strength as sort of a kind of abhorrent, talking about claiming that she'd said to her husband, if he didn't go and fight for the king, she'd put on the breeches and go and fight herself. So these are kind of played back to the people of the Isle of Man as sort of evidence that she is a sort of, she is something, so there's something kind of horrible and inappropriate and sort of to be rejected about her and her behaviour. And so they manage to inveigle their way into the favour of William Christian, who we saw, the chap on the left there, the receiver of the Isle of Man, and to persuade him that, and he doesn't need that much persuading, that he ought to quietly betray her. So she's in Castle Rushen in here we see it, with her two small boys who are there, her chaplain, her kitchen staff, series of ladies, 130 of them, and 60 soldiers of the garrison. So she's got, there are people there, but it's not very many. And they start making siege preparations. She's done it before. She can do it again. So there's great sort of gathering in of all the supplies they're going to need, barrels of beer and food and gunpowder and so on. And Peel Castle is prepared as a place to which they can move because it's easier to defend because it's on a promontory. Their actual apartments are in this block here called Derby House, and they are ready there, prepared for this siege. And there's Peel Castle that I was referring to, where a great deal of additional supplies are laid in for holding out, which is what they're planning to do. Then news is heard of that the garrison, her people at Peel Castle, are mutinying, and she rides out herself. I mean, this is pretty amazing stuff. Here she's 51, she's a French aristocrat, 51, to raise the people of the Castle Rushen garrison and it's great howling wind, and she's there, absolutely sort of galvanising them to ride out to retake Peel Castle. They ride across this promontory here just as the tide is coming in, and they manage to retake it from the mutinous garrison. But they're slightly confused that there aren't that many people there. And the reason is that the English army, the parliamentarian army, has been spotted about to land on the north of the island. And William Christian, supposedly her own officer, has been in contact with the parliamentarians and is facilitating their arrival to take the island from her. She becomes aware that there's something very fishy going on. She calls Christian into her. He absolutely denies any disloyalty at all and swears on the Bible that he will remain true to her and support her. The great artillery of the parliamentarian army is unloaded onto the north of the island. Huge, great things like this, mortars, huge numbers of oxen that are pulling the arms and armour down from where they land to completely encircle Castle Rushen, which we just saw. And the reverberations of the movement of the men, the marching men and the artillery are felt. The Countess of Derby and her family are within the castle, absolutely determined not to surrender. The troops encircle it. There's so many of them because there's several thousand who have landed. And the man who's the lead at the head of this invasion force sends in a document to her to invite her to surrender. And in it, he references your late husband. And she reads those words and a kind of scream is heard and reported as coming, as being heard outside the walls at the news that her husband has already been executed. Now, she probably already knew, but it is clear that she can see obviously the grief and the devastation, must have been beyond words, but also sort of the opportunity at least to try and buy a bit of time by saying, I can't possibly talk to terms or anything at this point, I'm grieving, and so on. But obviously the devastation of that becoming publicly known among her own troops was pretty major, because it showed really that their whole cause was shot. Nonetheless, she's determined to hold it, but crucially, as the parliamentarian army surrounds them and the Derby, her own troops, are up on the walls of Castle Rushen, one of them, seeing the size of the artillery that's pointing at them, in a sort of moment of kind of mad courage, leaps from the roof of the castle down into the moat, and is followed by a series of others. And then one of them pulls open the back door, as it were, of the castle and lets the parliamentarian army flood in, and the castle is taken. So she's forced at this point, it took to get this far before Charlotte, Countess of Derby, would surrender to anybody, but she was forced to. She'd held the island alone for 3 months, but she had no course of action now but surrender. Her final act of defiance was not to shred the articles of surrender, but when they were sent to her to sign, to make a real point of signing them without reading a single word. As in, I don't care what this is totally under duress, I'd sign anything. And she and her family are allowed to leave the island, but essentially they relinquish all of their possessions, other than their immediate, as it were, clothes on their back and so on, and return to England, in grief and defeat. Now, it is a very interesting thing about the Civil War period, is that the royalists who lose their lands, which the Stanleys do, are allowed by the parliamentarian government to retain the income from a fifth of their lands to live on, and then are allowed to, by paying a big fine, to regain their lands. And almost every significant royalist family does do this. The Derbys are specifically excluded from this because of their role in the Charles I re-invasion. But she applies herself over the course of the following months and years to lobbying to be allowed to regain their estates. And she draws on Thomas Fairfax and others who've been kind of a bit sympathetic to her to make the case. And she is ultimately successful in doing this. She absolutely uses her international connections. She has meetings with the Dutch ambassadors and says, makes a great point of talking about, my nephew, the Prince of Orange, and so on, really emphasising her position. And crucially, which we've heard a lot about, it's a real theme, she worked really hard to marry her daughters to aristocrats with money who are going to help to secure the family's position. And ultimately, she is successful in this. And she is able to raise the funds to pay the fines to regain the family lands, albeit obviously much financially imperiled. And there is a kind of amazing epilogue to this. So she lives out the rest of the parliamentarian, the Republican period, in her widow's weeds, in her mourning costume, which you see here, and there's another version of this painting just outside, absolutely sort of decrying the behaviour of the Republican government. But her lands, or the Derby lands, a good chunk of them, which she doesn't regain, are granted out to senior figures of the Republican government. And the Isle of Man is granted to Thomas Fairfax, who had been the lead general of the parliamentarian army, but who finds the execution of Charles I has gone too far, and so he kind of retires after this business with his wife at the trial. And he is granted all the lands. And he gives an extraordinary instruction to his steward, who then comes to him saying, well, here's all your income, sir, from all your lands. And he says, I want you to add up all the income that comes from the Isle of Man, and I want you to send it to Charlotte, Countess of Derby. And the steward is amazed. He says, but you can't possibly mean that. She's a royalist. You're the sort of you're the founding father of the new model army, and you're telling me to send the money to Charlotte, Countess of Derby. He says, I do not want her disadvantaged in anything. And she had been fighting him at the siege of Latham House. But I think that it really reflects the fact that, first of all, they were of, as it were, the same kind of class and the same sort of ancient sort of northern families. The fact that he felt the revolution had gone too far in executing the king and so on. And I think the fact that he himself was married to a formidable and outspoken woman who had cried out at the trial of Charles I, and he had a kind of real sense of respect for her. And he ordered William Christian, the receiver of Man, who had betrayed her, to be expelled from all his roles. And he said, receiver Christian has proved a deceiver Christian. And so Charlotte was very, very pleased to see him getting his comeuppance. And she would remark later that this single act of kindness by Lord Fairfax, Thomas Fairfax, her enemy, was the greatest act of generosity that anyone had done for her during the whole period, which is pretty amazing. So, sorry, I'm conscious I've gone a long time. I just want to end with a few concluding thoughts about the great Charlotte, Countess of Derby, Charlotte de la Tremouille, and what her story kind of tells us, I suppose, about the period and about this place. The first thing I'd say is it really reminds us about how women's positions really change in times of war. As is famously the case, it's after the First World War that the suffragettes are kind of successful in getting women the vote. And it's really a lot to do with the fact that during the First World War, women have to take a lot of roles that men traditionally took, and it really sort of expands the sense of what women are capable of and the opportunities that they have. And that's absolutely true through history, and we see it in this period. I mean, she was an extraordinary figure, but also the kind of turbulent events of the time, the need for her husband to be absent, leading, being in the army, gave her the sort of opportunity to do things that in times of peace she would never have had. The second thing to say is that I think characteristics of sort of female strength, unusual against the sort of normal models of the sort of modest, pious, obedient wife, are then used against strong women as ways of kind of castigating them. So all this business about calling her the whore of Babylon and talking about harridans and the taking of the male breeches and so on are ways to sort of discredit powerful women. And it was certainly used on the Isle of Man to convince the Manx people that they should abandon her. The third thing is I think it's really interesting to see how important women's, but also generally people's sense of their own lineage was to the way that they acted. Her sense of her grandfather having fought for Protestantism and fought for his nation, really strong in her. And this business of being prepared to see your own family, your own children potentially be hurt or injured and so on in actual combat, but that this was what, this was the blood that ran in her veins. It was really, really strong. And we see it also in the Earl of Derby's comment about having a death that was worthy of his blood, that being an aristocrat required a sort of honourable approach to things that meant that pragmatism often wasn't to the fore, and actually being prepared to die in your cause was. My fourth observation would be, and it really draws on what we've been hearing this morning as well, is about this business about marriages, how much they matter, and how much the continuity of your family and your estates really depend on these marriages being made and defended. So the kind of energy and the kind of determination to ensure that the sort of legal process in the case of Alice and others was favouring your own families was so important, and women's roles in making sure, both in making the matches, organising the marriages, but also in defending the rights that came with them was vital to ensuring the survival of these families. And then the last point really is to say that I think it also is a reminder that often with these things, whether it's the Civil War in this case, or we might talk about the Reformation or other periods of history, you can't assume that where people's loyalties went was where you think they'd go. So, the people who led the parliamentarian army were not, downtrodden revolutionaries or cloth workers or anything. They were aristocrats. And similarly, Charlotte, Countess of Derby, was a really committed Protestant, and so she wasn't naturally necessarily in sympathy with the Queen, Henrietta Maria. but also how much local issues matter. And the fact that the Earl of Derby was executed, this amazing relic before us embodying it, had so much to do with local grudges and senses of injustice, much more than it had to do with sort of the government in Westminster sending an edict that he should be executed. And actually those local relationships really matter. And when we study history, we must always remember about that part of the story, not just the big national story, but actually what were the things locally that concern people, and how those could then influence national events. Thank you very much.